Welcome to another episode of Vehicles That Should Be Added to War Thunder. The topic for today is American tank destroyer prototypes. These vehicles are related to the trio of fast tank destroyers employed by the United States during World War II, and as such will not be featuring casemate designs, which will be covered in a later video. To understand America's unique tank destroyers, I'll first review the American tank destroyer doctrine itself. In 1941, the military knew they had to create a specialized anti-tank task force, finding that organically weaving anti-tank capabilities into existing units was insufficient. The problem was that nobody knew where to put them. Either the infantry in a defensive role, the cavalry in an offensive role, or the artillery as heavy gun platforms. You might be surprised to learn that the Armored Corps was uninterested. They believed the platforms would be at odds with their general principle of maintaining an offense. Finally, General George Marshall declared anti-tank operations to be a cornerstone of the combined arms operations, and created a dedicated anti-tank board, under the command of Andrew Bruce and Leslie McNair. The Army experimented with this concept during the Louisiana Maneuvers Army exercises in 1941. Afterwards, Marshall was sufficiently impressed with their results and ordered the creation of dedicated tank destroyer units, whose sole purpose was to seek out and destroy enemy armored units. To this end, the vehicles emphasized speed and maneuverability over armor and survivability. In combat, these units operated under two different situations, defensively and offensively. On the defense, they were to be used to stop the famous Blitzkrieg-style attacks the Germans were known for. If an armored force was attempting a breakthrough, reconnaissance elements would scout out the best position for an ambush, and the tank destroyer units would quickly move into position to take out the advancing armor as they passed by. Offensively, they were not used to directly attack enemy armor, as this duty was given to Sherman tanks. Instead, they were placed in such a way as to stop enemy armored counterattacks. In this end, the doctrine was one of the most unique of the war, and no other major power quite employed tactics of this variety. After the war, the doctrine was no longer used as new technologies emerged in the 50s and 60s. In War Thunder, all major platforms are represented in the game. The M3 GMC, M10, M18, and M36 variants comprise all tank destroyer platforms used historically. However, there are a few other vehicles that would be interesting additions to the game. When work began on the first of these new tank destroyers, the Army used existing parts and past experiences when designing their new tank. The chassis of an M4A2 medium tank was chosen to serve as a base plate, and it was armed with a 3-inch M7 gun, taken from the M6 heavy tank. A simple circular open-top cast turret was used. This vehicle was designated 3-inch gun motor carriage T-35. Further development of this resulted in the well-known M10 GMC. Changing the turret design after the cast turret was found to be too difficult to produce. Later on, amid fears that the M4A2 chassis would be insufficient, a variant using the M4A3 chassis was developed, called the M10A1. Both would be good additions to the game. Following the creation of the M10, commander of the tank destroyer force, Lieutenant Colonel David Bruce, objected that the M10 and subsequent M36 were too slow to fit the needs of the tank destroyer doctrine. He believed that these new tanks should emphasize speed over all armor, and it was eventually realized that an entirely new chassis would be required for this. The end product of these designs was the M18 Hellcat, but there were a few notable steps along the way. The very first design envisioned a tank similar to the M22, using a similar chassis and gun, with the Wright Continental R975 radial aircraft engine. No prototypes of this were built. A few months later, the Army requested the gun be upgraded to a caliber of 57mm, and chassis switched from Christie suspension to coil spring. This vehicle was known as the 57mm GMC T49, and 2 pilot vehicles were built. Unfortunately for the T49, almost as quickly as it was prototyped, the tank destroyer force concluded that the Sherman's 75mm gun was superior for anti-tank duties, and so the second pilot vehicle was upgraded with a new turret, another open-top cast design with the same 75mm gun as the Sherman tank. This was known as the 57mm GMC T67. However, the Army was still unimpressed with its performance, and again demanded upgrades. The gun was increased to 76mm, a more powerful engine was put in, and the suspension was changed to torsion bar. The turret and hull received a major redesign as well. This led to the creation of the T-70, eventually standardized as the M18 GMC. The M18 ended up being the final design of the tank destroyer force, and served well in their roles. While the M18 doesn't have quite the design variety as the Sherman or Pershing, there is one variant worth discussing. In 1944, the Army built a pilot vehicle known as the 105mm howitzer motor carriage T-88, using a 105mm gun taken from a T-12 howitzer. While it's not entirely clear what the purpose of this vehicle was, it would be a powerful fire support vehicle to those who could properly use it. These tanks would be great contenders for the American tank destroyer line, which in-game has only a few tanks designated as such, especially for the purposes of event and battle pass tasks. These additions would both fill those gaps as well as add more options for American tankers in-game. What do you think? Are there any other tank destroyers you would add to the game? Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for future War Thunder content.